Imagine waking up in a world where flags outside your home are not of your country, but of Nazi Germany. The books in your school are rewritten to praise Adolf Hitler. Your language is no longer yours. Instead, you speak only what the regime allows. Your home, your job, your thoughts, everything is controlled. Sounds like a nightmare? What if I told you this could have been real? That history was just one battle away from being completely different? This is not fiction. This is not a Hollywood movie. This is history turned upside down. In our reality, the world celebrated in 1945 when Nazi Germany fell. Hitler was dead, Berlin was in ruins, and democracy survived. But what if history had taken a different path? What if Hitler had outsmarted the Allies? What if D-Day had failed? What if Germany had built the atomic bomb first? Close your eyes and picture this. A world where the swastika flies over London, Paris, and New York. A world where free speech does not exist, and people live under total surveillance. One man's dream of an Aryan empire ruling over billions would have become reality. Had Hitler won, the world map today would be unrecognizable. The United States would either be under German control or split between Nazi Germany and the Empire Japan. Europe would be completely under the iron grip of the Third Reich. Africa and Asia, exploited beyond imagination. And democracy, a forgotten concept. But how did this alternate history unfold? What led to Hitler's victory? And how did the world transform under Nazi rule? This is not just a theory. Historians have long debated how close Hitler actually came to winning. One small mistake by the Allies, one tiny delay, and everything could have changed. Let's go back to 1944. The Allied forces were preparing for D-Day, the largest military operation in history. But what if that mission had failed? What if the Nazis had pushed back the invasion? Hitler would have solidified his grip over Europe, turning the continent into an unbreakable fortress. Now imagine Germany developing nuclear weapons before the United States. Instead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, New York and Washington would have been reduced to ashes. The world would have surrendered to the Third Reich, and Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year empire would have begun. With Hitler in power, the world would be completely different. Schools would teach Nazi ideology. Art, literature, and science would only exist if they served the Nazi regime. Freedom of speech? Gone. Religion? Controlled or outlawed. Even personal choices, who you marry, where you work, will be dictated by the government. Imagine a world where history is rewritten, where no one knows the truth. A world where resistance is impossible, where secret police monitor every conversation. People who refuse to follow Nazi ideology would simply disappear. But even in this dark timeline, some would fight back. Would underground movements rise to challenge Nazi rule? Could Second World War erupt against the new German Empire? What if a rebellion started from within? History took the right path. Hitler lost. But we must ask ourselves, what if someone like him rises again? What if another leader dreams of world domination? This terrifying alternate history forces us to reflect on the past and prepare for the future. Because sometimes the difference between freedom and tyranny is just one battle. The world was on the brink of change. Victory and defeat were separated by mere moments, by choices made in war rooms, by luck, by fate. In our history, the Allies succeeded. But in this alternate timeline, things took a different turn, one that led to Hitler's ultimate victory. It all began in 1944, a year that would have determined the future of the world. The Allied forces had planned Operation Overlord, the infamous D-Day invasion. The beaches of Normandy were supposed to be the Allies' first step toward reclaiming Europe. But what if that step had been crushed before it could even begin? Imagine this. Hitler had anticipated the attack. His intelligence officers had intercepted secret messages, and instead of believing that Normandy was a decoy for a bigger invasion elsewhere, he had reinforced it with full force. When the Allied troops landed, they were met with an unbreakable German defense. Thousands of soldiers were slaughtered within minutes. The rough waters of the English Channel were stained red. The landing crafts were destroyed before they could even reach the shore. Instead of breaking through, the Allied forces were forced to retreat. This was the first major failure. Back in London and Washington, panic spread like wildfire. The operation had failed, and now Hitler's grip on Europe was stronger than ever. Churchill and Roosevelt had to rethink everything. The dream of reclaiming France had collapsed. Meanwhile, Hitler saw this as a sign. His destiny to rule the world was coming true. His generals had doubted him before, but now they bowed to his leadership. The Third Reich celebrated their victory at Normandy, believing that the war had turned in their favor. But Hitler wasn't just satisfied with defending Europe. He wanted to crush his enemies once and for all. With the Allies weakened, he focused on his most dangerous enemy, the Soviet Union. Here's where history took its darkest turn. In our reality, the brutal Eastern Front was Hitler's downfall. The Soviet forces had pushed back the Nazis, slowly reclaiming their territory until they finally stormed Berlin. But in this alternate history, Hitler had been given an unexpected advantage. With D-Day failing, the Western Allies had to delay their support to the Soviets. They were forced to protect their own territories first, which meant the Soviet Union was left to fight alone. And then, a critical mistake. Stalin, desperate for a breakthrough, launched a rush counterattack. He sent millions of Soviet troops into a trap set by the Germans. Entire divisions were surrounded and wiped out. The once powerful Red Army crumbled under the weight of German firepower. Moscow fell. Stalin was either killed or taken prisoner. The Soviet Union, once Hitler's greatest threat, was no more. Now, Hitler controlled Europe from west to east. There was no one left to stop him. With Russia out of the war, Hitler redirected his forces toward Britain. Churchill knew they couldn't hold out forever. Without American troops on the ground in Europe, without the Soviet Union to apply pressure from the east, Britain was next. Hitler ordered a relentless bombing campaign, even more destructive than in our reality. Britain suffered night after night of devastating air raids. Cities burned, supply lines were cut, food and fuel became scarce. And then, Hitler delivered his final blow. A massive German invasion fleet crossed the English Channel, this time backed by elite SS divisions and advanced weapons. The Royal Navy fought bravely, but Germany had planned too well. British forces were overrun. London fell. Churchill was captured, or perhaps he took his own life, refusing to be paraded as a prisoner. The British government collapsed. And just like that, Europe was completely under Nazi rule. But Hitler knew that his greatest enemy still remained: the United States. In 1945, America was still the world's strongest industrial power. But without bases in Britain, without allies in Europe, how could they fight Hitler alone? The answer? They couldn't. By this time, Germany had made breakthroughs in technology. The war had given them time to develop long-range missiles, powerful submarines, and even early versions of jet fighters. But the most terrifying development was their race for nuclear power. In our timeline, the United States developed the first atomic bombs. But what if Nazi Germany had done it first? What if, instead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the first nuclear bomb had been dropped on New York? The world would never be the same again. By 1946, Hitler had turned Europe into a fortress, controlled most of Africa, and was preparing for an invasion of the United States. The world was now divided into two forces, Nazi Germany and the Empire Japan. Freedom was fading. Democracy was dying, and the world was on the verge of entering a new dark age. But even in this horrifying alternate reality, was there still hope? Could the United States find a way to strike back before it was too late? Or was the Nazi Empire truly unstoppable? The answer lies ahead. The world had changed forever. The swastika flew over every major city: London, Paris, Moscow, and even Washington, D.C. The old governments had collapsed. The ideals of democracy, freedom, and equality had been erased from existence. The Third Reich reigned supreme. But what did this new world look like? For the people living under Nazi rule, life was a nightmare. There was no free speech, no protests, no resistance. You obeyed or you disappeared. In Europe, Hitler's vision had become reality. Schools no longer taught history as it had happened. Instead, they taught Hitler's version of history, a world where he was a savior, where the Aryan race was superior, and where his enemies had always been traitors. Books that didn't align with Nazi beliefs had been burned. Libraries were filled only with Nazi propaganda. Children were taken from their families and indoctrinated into Hitler's ideology from birth. Boys were raised to be soldiers. Girls were taught that their only purpose was to serve as mothers to the Aryan race. Those who didn't fit into this vision, they vanished. The Jewish population had been completely wiped out. There was no trace of their existence left. Museums had been emptied, cultural sites erased, history rewritten to pretend they had never been there. The same fate awaited anyone who was seen as unworthy in Hitler's eyes: people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus individuals, and those from races he deemed inferior. But the horror didn't end there. The Nazi war machine didn't stop with Europe. Africa was completely taken over, stripped of its resources, and turned into a massive slave labor camp. Millions were forced to work under brutal conditions, building weapons and cities for the Reich. In Asia, Hitler's allies, the Japanese Empire, controlled the eastern half of the world, enforcing their own version of tyranny. Together, Germany and Japan had divided the world between them, ruling with absolute power. And what about the United States? After Britain fell, America stood as the last major power against the Nazis. But the war had drained them. With no European allies, the fight was impossible. Germany's nuclear program was completed in 1946, and the first bomb was dropped on New York. Within weeks, Washington and Los Angeles suffered the same fate. With their cities destroyed and their people in terror, the United States surrendered. On January 1st, 1947, Hitler addressed the world in a historic speech, declaring the beginning of the Thousand-Year Reich. He proclaimed that war was over, not because peace had been achieved, but because all resistance had been crushed. Now, with the world under Nazi rule, life was dictated by strict laws. People were constantly monitored. There were cameras on every street. Informants were everywhere. You could not trust your neighbors, your friends, or even your own family. One wrong word could mean death. The world had become a machine of oppression. Those who tried to resist were hunted down and executed. Entire cities were wiped out if they dared to rebel. Technology advanced under Nazi control, but not for the benefit of humanity. Science was focused on developing better weapons, better surveillance systems, and better ways to control the population. The dream of space exploration? Gone. The idea of human rights? Erased. This was a world under Hitler's rule, a world where fear controlled everything, where there was no hope, and where freedom was nothing more than a distant memory. But was this truly the end? Or was there still a chance for resistance? Was there a way to fight back against the most powerful empire the world had ever seen? The answer lies ahead. For years, the world had been living under the iron fist of Hitler's empire. Fear controlled everything. The swastika was everywhere, on buildings and schools, on people's arms. The air was heavy with silence because no one dared to speak against the Reich. But something had been growing in the shadows, a resistance. Even in the darkest moments, there were people who refused to be broken. They remembered freedom. They whispered about a time before Nazi rule, and they were willing to die fighting for it. At first, the resistance was small, just a few survivors, former soldiers, and hidden intellectuals. They moved in secret, spreading messages of hope where they could. A single phrase became their battle cry. The Reich is not forever. Those 5 words became a symbol of defiance. They were carved into walls, passed on in hushed conversations, hidden in the pages of forbidden books. The Nazis tried to erase them, but the more they erased, the stronger the message became. The underground army. Across Europe and America, small groups began to unite. Former American soldiers, British spies who had survived, and civilians who had lost everything formed what would become the largest underground movement in history. They used abandoned subway tunnels, hidden bunkers, and forgotten military bases to train. They had no advanced weapons, no armies, and no air force. But they had something even stronger, nothing left to lose. The resistance had one goal: destroy the Reich from within. They began attacking key Nazi supply lines. Trains carrying weapons were derailed in the dead of night. Communication lines were cut, leaving Nazi officers confused and vulnerable. Resistance fighters disguised themselves as Nazi soldiers to steal information and sabotage operations. Then came their most daring mission yet, the assassination attempt. In 1951, the resistance saw a chance to strike at the heart of the Nazi Empire. Hitler was set to make a public speech in Berlin, celebrating the 20th anniversary of his victory. It was an opportunity they could not ignore. A team of resistance fighters infiltrated the city. Their plan was simple but deadly: plant explosives near the stage where Hitler would speak. A single explosion could change everything. But nothing ever went as planned. Just as the explosives were being placed, a young German officer, one who secretly hated the Reich, discovered the resistance fighters. But instead of turning them in, he made a fateful decision. He helped them. The bomb was planted. The countdown began. The world held its breath. But at the last second, something went wrong. A Nazi officer noticed something suspicious. The alarm was raised. The explosives were discovered and deactivated. The resistance fighters tried to escape, but only a few made it out alive. The rest were captured. And their fates? Execution, live on television, as a warning to all who dared to defy the Reich. The mission had failed, but something unexpected happened. The world saw the resistance. They saw people willing to die fighting against Hitler. And that single act of defiance inspired millions. The spark of revolution. The failed assassination wasn't the end. It was the beginning. People who had been too afraid to resist before began rising up. Farmers poisoned Nazi food supplies. Scientists sabotaged weapons development. Even Nazi officers, secretly disgusted by what they had become, began working against their own government. Then, in 1953, something happened that the Reich had never expected: the Great Rebellion. In America, the remnants of the old U.S. government had been hiding deep underground. They had no military, no resources, but they had intelligence, and they had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. On July 4th, 1953, the resistance launched the largest rebellion in history. Across the world, rebels attacked at the same time. In Paris, hidden explosives destroyed Nazi military bases. In London, entire battalions of Nazi soldiers were taken down by ambushes. In Washington, the American resistance stormed the Nazi headquarters. For the first time in years, the Reich was losing. Hitler's last stand. The war had turned. The resistance had the advantage now. But there was one final obstacle: the man who had started it all. Adolf Hitler was hiding in a heavily guarded fortress in Berlin. He knew his empire was falling, but he refused to surrender. On October 1st, 1953, the resistance reached Berlin. A massive battle erupted. Nazi soldiers fought desperately to defend their leader. But the resistance had come too far to turn back now. As bombs fell and gunfire echoed through the city, a small team of resistance fighters broke into Hitler's bunker. They found him there, an old, paranoid man, holding a pistol, trembling in fear. And in that moment, history changed forever. Hitler's reign was over. The world was free. But the scars of his empire would never be forgotten. The war was over. The Reich had fallen. The swastika, once a symbol of fear, was now nothing more than torn fabric, burned and discarded in the streets. But victory came at a cost. The world was in ruins. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Millions were dead. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but war, oppression, and fear. Now, for the first time in decades, humanity had a chance to rebuild. But the question remained: how do you rebuild a world that has been completely reshaped by evil? The trial of the century. The first step toward rebuilding was justice. The leaders of the Nazi regime had to answer for their crimes. Captured Nazi officials were brought to trial in what became known as the Second Nuremberg Trials. Unlike the first trials in the 1940s, these trials were even bigger, even more significant. In a grand courtroom, the world watched as the architects of Hitler's empire were forced to stand before their victims. The evidence was undeniable. Millions had been murdered. Cultures had been erased. Freedom had been stolen. Some Nazi leaders, still delusional in their belief in the Reich, refused to admit guilt. They stood in defiance, still saluting Hitler's name. But the world had seen enough. There would be no mercy. The verdicts were swift. Guilty. One after another, the men who had built the Nazi empire were sentenced to life in prison, to exile, to execution. The message was clear. The world would never allow such evil to rise again. A world without borders. With Hitler's empire destroyed, the world had a choice. For years, nations had been divided. By war, by fear, by hate. The Reich had thrived on division, turning people against each other, using racism and propaganda to fuel its power. Now, people wanted something different. The United Nations, once weak and powerless, was reborn. But this time, it was not just a coalition of countries. It became something greater, a global alliance, a united force against tyranny. Borders were redrawn. In some places, they were erased entirely. Former Nazi-occupied territories were given back to their people. But the scars of war ran deep. The fight for freedom. Not everyone accepted the new world. There were still those who clung to the ideals of the Reich. Small Nazi factions retreated into the shadows, hoping to rebuild their empire in secret. They launched attacks on government officials, set off bombs in newly freed cities, and spread whispers of Hitler's return. But the world had learned from the past. For every act of terror, there was a stronger act of resistance. Survivors of the war, former soldiers, resistance fighters, and even ex-Nazi officers who had turned against Hitler, hunted down the last remnants of the Reich. There would be no second rise. Rebuilding a shattered society. The damage done by Hitler's rule was more than physical. It was psychological. For years, people had been brainwashed by Nazi propaganda. Children had grown up believing in Aryan superiority. Families had been taught to hate their neighbors. How do you undo that kind of damage? Education became the key. Schools were rebuilt, not to teach war, but to teach peace. The truth about the Reich was exposed in every classroom. Survivors shared their stories. The horrors of the Holocaust were shown in detail. The goal was simple: never again. Museums were built, not to glorify the past, but to remind future generations of the dangers of hatred. Every crime of the Reich was documented. Every name of the victims was remembered. History would not be erased. The rise of a new era. As years passed, the world began to heal. Where Nazi banners once stood, new flags were raised. Where Hitler's face had been displayed, statues of resistance heroes were built instead. Technology advanced, not for war, but for progress. Space exploration was revived. Science focused on rebuilding the planet, healing the wounds of war, and ensuring that power would never again fall into the hands of dictators. A new world order had begun, not one of oppression, but of unity. But the question remained: could humanity truly learn from its past? Or would history, one day, repeat itself? That was a question only time could answer. The Reich was vast. It stretched across continents, swallowing nations in its brutal grip. Hitler's iron rule was absolute, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, hidden in the shadows, rebellion was rising. Not everyone had surrendered. Not everyone had accepted the Nazi vision, and some were willing to die to destroy it. The world may believe that Hitler was unstoppable, but in the darkest corners of his empire, whispers of resistance spread like wildfire. Would they succeed, or would they be crushed before they could even strike? The underground resistance, fighting from the shadows. The Nazi war machine was ruthless. Cities were patrolled day and night. Soldiers watched every street, every home. Speaking against the Reich was a death sentence. Yet, in the very heart of occupied cities, in basements, abandoned tunnels, and even inside the Nazi ranks themselves, resistance groups formed. They had different names, different methods, different leaders. But they had one common goal: to bring the Reich down. In France, the Maquis hid in the mountains, striking German convoys and surprise attacks. In Britain, the secret resistance front worked from the shadows, sending coded messages to underground operatives across Europe. And in Germany itself, there were those who dared to fight from within. The plan to kill Hitler, an alternate assassination mission. Killing Hitler was nearly impossible. He was heavily guarded, paranoid, always surrounded by his inner circle. Yet, against all odds, a plan emerged. A secret group within the Reich, high-ranking officers who had seen the horrors of Hitler's rule, began plotting against him. Their plan? A silent coup. They knew that as long as Hitler lived, the war would never end. The genocide would never stop. So they made a choice. One of them, an officer with direct access to Hitler, prepared a briefcase bomb. The plan was simple: get close, leave the case under his desk, walk away, let history change. The day arrived. The officer entered the room where Hitler was holding a meeting. The bomb was placed. The seconds ticked down. Then, an unexpected movement. A general accidentally knocked the briefcase aside, just far enough that when it detonated, Hitler survived. The explosion ripped through the room. Fire and debris filled the air. Bodies were shattered. But Hitler? He lived. The coup failed. The conspirators were hunted down, executed one by one. And Hitler? His paranoia grew. He became more ruthless, more violent. The resistance had gambled everything and lost. The largest resistance movement. Where did the real fight begin? Though assassinations failed, the war was far from over. The largest rebellion didn't come from the secret meetings of officers or the underground spies. It came from the people. In the Soviet Union, entire villages took up arms against Nazi occupation. Farmers, teachers, and even children became soldiers overnight. In Poland, the Warsaw Uprising erupted, a desperate, all-out battle where civilians fought German tanks with homemade weapons and sheer determination. In America, an underground resistance was secretly supplying weapons and intelligence to the last free nations, preparing for the day they could strike back. And in Germany itself, a resistance was growing even inside the Reich. Former Nazi officers who had seen the truth began feeding information to the Allied forces. Scientists working on Hitler's secret weapons sabotaged their own projects. Not everyone was blind. Not everyone was willing to let the world burn. And then something happened. A message. A single broadcast that changed everything. A secret signal the rebellion ignites. One night, across all occupied territories, radios crackled to life. A coded message played. A phrase only the resistance would understand. The eagle has fallen. It was a signal. All at once, resistance fighters across the world rose from the shadows. Explosions tore through Nazi supply lines. Convoys were ambushed. Entire cities were thrown into chaos. It wasn't just an attack. It was a message. The Reich was not invincible. The world had not surrendered. And the fight had only just begun. The moment of truth, victory, or death. As the resistance grew bolder, Hitler's grip tightened. He ordered mass executions, complete annihilation of rebel towns, and the total destruction of any city that dared to defy him. The world was on the brink. And then, one final, desperate mission. A rebel force, disguised as high-ranking Nazi officials, infiltrated a top-secret German facility. Their target? The Reich's hidden war plans. If they could steal them, they could expose Hitler's final strategy to the world. The mission was suicide, but they had no choice. Inside the facility, alarms blared. Gunfire erupted. The rebels fought their way through, losing men at every corner. Their leader, wounded and bleeding, made it to the records room. He grabbed the files. The truth was now in their hands. But could they escape? Outside, enemy soldiers closed in. The resistance was surrounded. There was no way out. And then, a single flare lit up the sky. The signal. The final call. All across the world, the resistance had risen. The fight had begun. And nothing, not even the Reich, could stop them now. Would they win? Or was this the final stand? The answer would shape history forever. The world had changed. The Reich was gone. The battles had been fought. The sacrifices had been made. But in the end, what did it all mean? What if things had been different? What if Hitler had won and no one had fought back? What if fear had silenced the world forever? These were the questions history demanded we ask. Because history is not just about the past. It is about the future. The fall of the Nazi Empire was not just a victory of armies. It was a victory of the human spirit. It proved that no matter how strong evil becomes, no matter how many people surrender to it, there will always be those who resist. And resistance, no matter how small, can change everything. The cost of complacency. One of the greatest lessons of this alternate history was simple. Evil does not rise overnight. The Reich did not appear from nothing. It started with words, with ideas, with propaganda that turned neighbors against each other, with small laws that stripped away freedom one piece at a time. It started with people saying, "It's not my problem. It won't affect me. I'm just following orders." And before they knew it, they had become part of the machine. This was the danger of complacency. This was how tyranny spread. The power of a single choice. But if history had shown the power of evil, it had also shown the power of a single choice. One person refusing to stay silent. One soldier choosing not to fire. One citizen choosing to hide a fugitive instead of turning them in. History was shaped not just by dictators, but by ordinary people who decided to stand up when it mattered most. It was not always easy. It was not always safe. But it was always necessary. And that was the greatest lesson of all. Never again? After the fall of Hitler's empire, the world swore that it would never happen again. Never again would people be enslaved by ideology. Never again would a dictator rise while the world stood silent. Never again would humanity let fear turn into genocide. But history has a habit of repeating itself. And the truth is, the fight against oppression never ends. It is not something that is won once and forgotten. It is something that must be fought for in every generation. Because the moment we stop watching, the moment we stop questioning, that is when history repeats itself. That is when another Reich is born. The only question left is, will we be ready?